February 19, 1945, the morning Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had dreaded for months finally arrived as the first American shells screamed across the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. From his underground command post deep beneath Mount Suribachi, he could feel the tremors of explosions that would soon transform this 8-square-mile island into a graveyard for thousands of his men. Kuribayashi, a 53-year-old cavalry officer who had once studied in America and understood the industrial might of his enemy, knew with grim certainty that no Japanese soldier would leave this island alive. Yet he had turned Iwo Jima into something unprecedented in Pacific warfare, a fortress designed not to win, but to make the Americans pay in blood for every foot of volcanic ash. The general's journey to this moment had begun in June 1944, when Imperial headquarters assigned him command of the island's defense. Unlike other Japanese commanders who favored suicidal banzai charges, Kuribayashi possessed a coldly rational understanding of modern warfare. He had spent 9 months transforming Iwo Jima into an underground maze of tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions that stretched 11 miles beneath the island's surface. His 21,000 soldiers, a force composed of the 109th Division, the 2nd Mixed Brigade, and various naval units, had labored like miners, digging through solid rock with hand tools and limited explosives. They carved out artillery emplacements with interlocking fields of fire, hospital caverns, ammunition storage rooms, and command centers connected by narrow passages that could shelter troops from the heaviest bombardment. According to military historian Derek Wright's research on the Pacific Campaign, Kuribayashi's defensive strategy represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Japanese military doctrine that emphasized offensive spirit over defensive preparation. Captain Toshihiko Ono, commanding an artillery battery on the island's northern plateau, watched through his observation post as the American armada materialized on the horizon like an apocalyptic vision. More than 800 ships, battleships, carriers, destroyers, and transport vessels stretched across the Pacific as far as the eye could see. For 72 consecutive days, before this invasion, American bombers and naval guns had pounded Iwo Jima with unprecedented ferocity, dropping more than 6,800 tons of bombs and firing over 22,000 shells at the tiny island. Yet Kuribayashi's underground fortress had absorbed this punishment with minimal casualties. His orders had been absolute: no firing at reconnaissance planes, no response to preliminary bombardments, complete radio silence. Every gun emplacement remained hidden, every soldier concealed in the volcanic rock, waiting for the moment when American Marines would wade ashore and enter the killing zones. Private First Class Kiyoshi Endo crouched in a concrete pillbox, disguised as a natural rock formation on the eastern beaches, his hands trembling as he gripped his Arisaka rifle. The 22-year-old conscript from Hokkaido had received Kuribayashi's final message to his troops, words that offered no false hope. Each man will make it his duty to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. Endo understood that the Empire had already written off Iwo Jima and its defending forces. No reinforcements would arrive, no evacuation fleet would rescue survivors. The island existed for a single strategic purpose: to delay the American advance toward the Japanese homeland by extracting such a terrible cost that perhaps somehow the enemy might reconsider their demand for unconditional surrender. As landing craft began separating from the massive fleet, Endo whispered a prayer to ancestors he would soon join, wondering if his death on this volcanic rock would mean anything at all. February 19, 1945, at 9:02 in the morning, the first wave of American Ma Rhines hit the beaches, and Lieutenant General Kuribayashi watched through periscopes from his command post as his trap began to close. For 17 long minutes, he held his fire while 8 battalions of Marines, nearly 9,000 men, struggled through the loose volcanic ash that rose to their ankles with each step. The black sand defeated their vehicles, immobilizing tanks and trucks as they churned uselessly against the steep terraces that rose from the waterline. Still, Kuribayashi waited, allowing more landing craft to discharge their human cargo onto the narrow beaches that would soon become a slaughterhouse. At precisely 9:19, he gave the signal that unleashed hell. Major Yoshitaka Hori, stationed at the communications center on Chichijima, received the coded message that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Enemy landing. All units commence firing. From every concealed position, from Mount Suribachi in the south, from the broken terrain in the center, from the Motoyama Plateau in the north, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire simultaneously with devastating precision. Captain Ono's artillery bat, Eri, began firing shells that had been pre-registered on exact coordinates during months of preparation. His gunners worked with mechanical efficiency, dropping high-explosive rounds onto the packed beaches where Marines huddled behind whatever cover they could find. The volcanic ash that had impeded the American advance now became their enemy in another way. Each explosion sent showers of hot rock fragments spraying in all directions, multiplying the killing effect of every shell. Sergeant Takichi Nishi, a former Olympic gold medalist in equestrian sports who now commanded a tank unit, directed his Type 97 tanks from concealed positions near the 2nd Airfield. The 42-year-old nobleman had been a celebrity in Japan, a baron who had brought honor to the empire at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. Now he watched his tanks, obsolete compared to American Shermans but perfectly positioned in hull-down defensive positions, firing their 47mm guns at enemy vehicles struggling through the ash. Nishi understood modern combined arms warfare better than most Japanese officers. He had studied cavalry tactics in America during the 1920s and recognized that static defense, not mobile counterattack, offered the only hope of inflicting maximum casualties. His tank crews worked in coordination with infantry teams who moved through the tunnel system, appearing to strike at American flanks before vanishing underground like ghosts. Private Endo's pillbox shuddered as an American tank fired its 75mm gun at his position, but the concrete walls held. Through the narrow firing slit, he could see Marines attempting to advance up the terraces, their movements slow and exhausted as they fought through the volcanic ash while carrying weapons and equipment. His machine gun position HI had been carefully sighted to create crossfire with 2 other bunkers, a triangulation that turned the beach approaches into a geometry of death. When he pressed the trigger, his Type 92 machine gun chattered, sending 7.7mm rounds into the advancing Americans. He felt nothing, no joy in killing, no hatred for the enemy, only a mechanical determination to follow orders and fulfill his duty before the inevitable counterfire found his position. Above his head, reinforced concrete absorbed shell after shell as American destroyers attempted to silence his bunker with direct naval gunfire. By nightfall on the first day, approximately 30,000 American troops had landed on Iwo Jima, and Kuribayashi's forces had inflicted over 2,000 casualties, a ratio that would have spelled defeat in any previous Pacific battle. Yet the general knew this was merely the beginning. American artillery was already being positioned ashore. American tanks were being concentrated for breakthrough attacks, and the overwhelming firepower of the American military machine was being organized for systematic destruction of his defensive positions. In his command post, Kuribayashi drafted a message to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, carefully avoiding the triumphalist language that characterized most Japanese military communications. His report was coldly factual. The enemy had established a beachhead, despite heavy casualties. Japanese losses had been moderate, and the battle would continue according to plan. The plan, which everyone understood, but no one stated explicitly, was to kill Americans until the last Japanese soldier died fighting. February 23, 1945. Colonel Kanehiko Atsushi watched from observation posts on Mount Suribachi as American Marines began their assault on the volcano that dominated the southern end of Iwo Jima. The 550-foot mountain had become a symbol that both sides recognized must be taken or held, not for its tactical value alone, but for the psychological impact its capture would represent. Atsushi commanded approximately 1,300 troops who had transformed Suribachi into a fortress within a fortress, with 7 levels of tunnels and caves connected by narrow passages that allowed defenders to move freely while remaining invisible to the enemy above. His artillery and mortar positions, cleverly positioned, on the volcano's northern slopes where they could fire onto the beaches while remaining shielded from naval gunfire, had inflicted terrible casualties during the landing days. Now the Americans were coming to silence those guns, and Atsushi knew his men would fight to the last round. The assault began with a bombardment that exceeded anything yet experienced on the island. Naval guns fired shells as large as 16 inches in diameter, projectiles weighing over a ton each, that slammed into the volcano's rocky flanks with earth-shaking force. Marine artillery batteries, now established ashore in growing numbers, added their shells to the barrage. Now size. The fighter bombers swept low over Suribachi, dropping napalm that turned sections of the mountain into rivers of fire. Yet most of this awesome firepower was wasted. The defenders remained deep underground, protected by layers of volcanic rock and concrete, waiting for the bombardment to lift and the inevitable infantry assault to begin. Lieutenant Toshio Kobayashi, a former schoolteacher commanding an infantry platoon inside Suribachi, gathered his 40 remaining soldiers in a large cave that served as their assembly point. He read them a final message from Kuribayashi. Do not expect to return alive. Fight until the last man. Sergeant Nishi, whose tank unit had been defending the approaches to the volcano, watched as American Marines methodically reduced Japanese positions one by one, using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-range tank fire. The systematic destruction impressed him despite his situation. The Americans had learned from their early mistakes and now employed combined arms tactics that slowly overwhelmed isolated strongpoints. When a bunker revealed itself by firing, American infantry would pin it down with rifle fire, while engineers crawled forward to place explosive charges directly against firing ports. Tanks would maneuver to positions where they could fire point-blank into cave entrances. Flamethrowers sent streams of burning gasoline into tunnels, consuming the oxygen and incinerating anyone caught in the confined spaces. Nishi, who had befriended many Americans during his time abroad, felt a strange admiration for the enemy's adaptation and learning. These were not the easy victories Japanese propaganda had promised. February 23, 1945, at 10:20 in the morning, Sergeant Schrier's 40-man patrol from Easy Company reached Suribachi's summit and raised a small American flag they had carried from below. Colonel Atsuchi, still alive in the tunnel complex beneath their feet, received reports of the flag raising with stoic acceptance. The summit had always been indefensible, too exposed, too vulnerable to the overwhelming firepower the Americans could concentrate on any position. The real fortress existed in the underground labyrinth where his remaining troops still fought. Throughout that day and night, Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels and caves to attack the Marines now occupying the crater, launching small-scale raids that led several Americans before the attackers were gunned down. Private Endo, who had survived the beach fighting and retreated into Suribachi's caves, participated in one of these counterattacks, firing his rifle at shadowy figures in the darkness before a grenade concussion knocked him unconscious. He awoke hours later, wounded and disoriented, deep in a tunnel that had partially collapsed from American demolition charges above. The fighting for Mount Suribachi continued for 3 more days after the famous flag raising, as American engineers systematically sealed caves with explosives and bulldozed shut tunnel entrances, entombing hundreds of Japanese soldiers alive in the volcanic rock. Colonel Atsuchi died during this period, killed by naval shellfire that penetrated his command cave. Lieutenant Kobayashi and most of his platoon perished when flamethrower fuel ignited ammunition stored in their defensive position, creating an explosion that collapsed an entire section of tunnels. By February 26th, organized resistance on Suribachi had ended, though isolated Japanese soldiers would continue emerging from caves to fight for weeks afterward. The mountain had cost the Americans more than 900 casualties, while approximately 1,200 Japanese defenders had died in its tunnels and caves. For Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, watching from his northern command post, the fall of Suribachi had the loss of critical artillery positions and observation posts, but it had consumed 4 days of American effort and resources, 4 days closer to his strategic goal of making the invasion too costly to sustain. March 1, 1945. The battle entered its most savage phase as American Marines pushed northward into terrain that reduced combat to its most primitive and brutal form. The central portion of Iwo Jima contained a broken landscape that Japanese defenders had transformed into an interconnected fortress of bunkers, caves, and hidden firing positions that Americans would come to call the meat grinder. Here, in an area little more than a square mile, Japanese defensive preparations reached their highest sophistication. Major Yasuta Kasuanaga commanded this sector, where every rock outcropping concealed a fighting position, every depression hid a mortar pit, and every ridge connected to tunnels that allowed rapid reinforcement and withdrawal. The Americans would capture ground during daylight hours at terrible cost, only to discover that Japanese soldiers had infiltrated back into positions during darkness, using the underground passages. Artillery Captain Ono, whose battery had been firing continuously since the invasion began, now found himself directing fire at ranges so close that his guns sometimes hit friendly positions. The fluid nature of the fighting in the meat grinder made traditional fire control nearly impossible. Front lines shifted constantly. Japanese and American forces often occupied adjacent positions, separated by mere yards, and the broken terrain made observation difficult. His crews worked like automatons, loading and firing their Type 91 field guns until barrels glowed red hot, then cooling them with precious water before resuming fire. Ono had lost more than half his gunners to American counter-battery fire, but replacement crews appeared from the infantry reserves as Kuribayashi ruthlessly stripped non-essential personnel to maintain his artillery capability. The general understood that artillery represented his only means of matching American firepower, even if the match was grotesquely unequal. In a hospital cave beneath the Motoyama Plateau, Dr. Kiyoshi Sueyoshi worked by flashlight and candlelight, performing surgeries without adequate anesthesia, antibiotics, or even clean water. The 38-year-old surgeon had trained at Tokyo Imperial University and served with distinction in China, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the conditions on Iwo Jima. Wounded soldiers lay in rows on the cave floor, their injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to traumatic amputations. He could do little for most of them beyond offering water and morphine when available, which it rarely was. The stench of gangrene and infection filled the cave, mixing with the sulfurous fumes that seeped from volcanic vents in the rock. Outside, American flamethrower teams and demolition squads methodically worked through the defensive positions, sealing caves and bunkers one by one. Dr. Sueyoshi knew his hospital would eventually be discovered and destroyed, but he continued treating patients with whatever supplies remained, finding purpose in his duty even as the situation became hopeless. Private First Class Endo, recovered from his wounds on Suribachi, had been assigned to a new unit defending what Americans called Turkey Knob, a particularly well-fortified hill mass that anchored the Japanese center. His pillbox overlooked a small valley that Marines had to cross to advance northward, and his machine gun position had claimed dozens of lives in the past week. Yet Endo had changed. The initial fear had been replaced by a kind of mechanical numbness. He loaded ammunition belts, aimed at moving targets, fired controlled burrs, and occasionally ate rice balls when food appeared from the supply tunnels. He no longer thought about home or family or the meaning of his death. Such thoughts were luxuries that belonged to people who had futures. According to historian Richard Wheeler's detailed accounts of the Pacific fighting, this psychological transformation, from fear through acceptance to a kind of empty functionality, characterized many Japanese soldiers during the battle's middle phase, as the certainty of death removed the anxiety of uncertainty. March 5, 1945, after days of brutal fighting, American forces finally secured the meat grinder, capturing Turkey Knob and the adjacent hills at a cost of thousands of casualties. Private Endo died during the final assault, killed by a flamethrower burst that immolated his position after a week of continuous fighting. Major Suenaga, his command post about to be overrun, committed ritual suicide with his sword, rather than face capture. Captain Ono's artillery battery fell silent when American tanks destroyed his last gun, though Ono himself survived and withdrew into the tunnel system with his remaining crew members. Dr. Sueyoshi's hospital cave was sealed with demolition charges, killing the wounded patients inside, though the doctor himself escaped through a side tunnel and continued north with the retreating survivors. For Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, the loss of the meat grinder represented the collapse of his central defensive line, but it had consumed 2 weeks of American effort and inflicted casualty rates that shocked commanders planning future operations against the Japanese home islands. March 10, 1945. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi withdrew his remaining forces into the island's northern pocket, a rugged square mile of broken terrain that represented his final defensive position. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers still survived from the original garrison of 21,000, though many were wounded and all were exhausted from weeks of continuous combat. The general established his headquarters in a large cave complex near Kitano Point, where he continued directing the defense with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the entire campaign. Yet something had shifted in Kuribayashi's communications during this final phase. His messages to Imperial headquarters took on a philosophical tone, reflecting on the meaning of sacrifice and duty as his command disintegrated around him. Baron Nishi, now reduced to fighting as an infantryman after his tanks were destroyed, joined Kuribayashi's headquarters as an aide. The former Olympic champion had been wounded 3 times, but refused evacuation to the hospital caves, knowing that hospitalization meant only a slower death. In the headquarters cave, he composed letters to his wife that could never be mailed, describing the courage of his men and the strange camaraderie that had developed among the survivors. Nishi, who spoke fluent English and understood American culture intimately, found himself wondering whether the Marines who would eventually kill him realized that Japanese soldiers were motivated by the same basic human emotions: loyalty to comrades, duty to family, and a desire to give their deaths meaning through honorable service. Such thoughts would have seemed treasonous earlier in the war, but in these final days, conventional thinking had lost its power. Captain Ono, commanding the remnants of several artillery units that had been consolidated into a composite battery, positioned his last 3 guns in a deep ravine that provided some protection from American counter-battery fire. His ammunition supply had dwindled to fewer than 50 rounds per gun, and he hoarded these precious shells for targets that warranted their expenditure. Water was now more valuable than ammunition. The American capture of Iwo Jima's fresh water sources meant that Japanese troops had been reduced to licking moisture from cave walls and drinking their own urine to stay alive. Ono's lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen from dehydration, yet he continued calculating firing solutions and directing his guns with professional competence. The irony was not lost on him that he would die of thirst on an island surrounded by an ocean of undrinkable salt water. Dr. Sueyoshi, operating from a new hospital cave in the northern pocket, faced impossible decisions about resource allocation. With medical supplies completely exhausted, he could offer nothing beyond basic first aid and comfort to the wounded men who continued arriving from the front lines. Some soldiers begged him to perform euthanasia rather than leave them to offer slow deaths from infection and dehydration, requests that violated every principle of his medical training, yet seemed merciful under the circumstances. Sueyoshi compromised by giving overdoses of the last morphine to the most severely wounded men, telling himself that pain relief rather than euthanasia was his intention, though the distinction had become meaningless. He had lost more than 30 pounds during the battle and suffered from severe dysentery, yet continued working because stopping would mean confronting the reality of his situation. March 15, 1945. American forces began their final offensive into the northern pocket, employing tactics refined through weeks of brutal experience. Rather than direct frontal assaults, they utilized massive artillery bombardments, followed by flamethrower and demolition teams that methodically sealed caves and destroyed bunkers. The advance measured progress in yards per day, sometimes yards per hour, as Japanese soldiers contested every position to the death. Kuribayashi, watching his command dissolve, drafted a final message to Imperial headquarters that was part military report, part philosophical meditation, and part apology for failing to hold the island longer. He wrote of his soldiers' extraordinary courage and requested that their families be informed that each man had fulfilled his duty completely. The message, transmitted on March 16th, ended with the phrase, "We farewell," an oddly poetic translation that reflected Kuribayashi's familiarity with English grammar. March 21st, 1945, organized Japanese resistance had collapsed into isolated pockets of defenders who fought from individual caves and bunkers without coordination or hope of relief. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, now commanding fewer than 200 soldiers capable of combat, prepared for a final action that would define the meaning of his campaign. Unlike other Japanese commanders who had led spectacular but strategically wasteful Enzai charges, Kuribayashi had successfully avoided mass suicidal attacks throughout the battle, preferring to extract maximum casualties through defensive attrition. Yet he understood that the end required some dramatic gesture, not for tactical reasons, but to demonstrate that Japanese soldiers could die with dignity and honor even in hopeless circumstances. He planned a final counterattack that would be disciplined and purposeful, rather than a mindless rush toward death. Baron Nishi, among the senior officers helping plan the final operation, felt conflicted about the coming attack. His Olympic experiences had taught him that competition could be noble without requiring death, that honorable defeat was sometimes more valuable than Pyrrhic victory. Yet these were American concepts, foreign to the Japanese military tradition that defined honor primarily through willingness to die for the emperor. Nishi found himself trapped between two value systems. His cosmopolitan experiences suggested that survival might serve Japan better than symbolic death, while his samurai heritage demanded that he choose extinction over surrender. In the end, tradition prevailed, and he volunteered to lead one of the assault groups that would emerge from the caves for the final attack. Before leaving the Toru headquarters cave, he destroyed his personal papers, including photographs of his wife and children, not wanting these intimate connections to be captured as trophies by American soldiers. Captain Ono's artillery battery had fallen silent, his guns destroyed, his ammunition expended, his surviving crewmen armed with rifles and grenades for infantry combat. The transformation from artillerymen to infantrymen required a psychological adjustment that some men made easily while others found impossible. Ono, trained in the scientific precision of indirect fire calculations, now faced the prospect of close-quarters combat against enemies who possessed overwhelming superiority in weapons, numbers, and supplies. He gathered his 23 remaining soldiers and explained the plan for the final counterattack with matter-of-fact directness. They would assault American positions at dawn, kill as many enemies as possible before being killed themselves, and die as Japanese soldiers rather than starve slowly in sealed caves. No one questioned the orders or suggested alternatives that might preserve lives. The social conditioning that valued group cohesion over individual survival remained absolute even at this terminal moment. Dr. Tsuyoshi, now treating fewer than a dozen patients who were too severely wounded to participate in the final attack, prepared the hospital cave for abandonment. He faced the unbearable decision of what to do with patients who could not be moved, leave them to die slowly from their wounds and dehydration, or kill them mercifully before departing. After consulting with a medical corpsman and a severely wounded lieutenant, they decided that patients would be given the choice. Those who wished to die immediately would receive lethal injections of air into their veins, while those who preferred to wait for American troops would be left with what little water remained. 5 men chose immediate death, 3 chose to wait, and 4 were unconscious and unable to choose. Tsuyoshi administered the injections with tears streaming down his face, then arranged the unconscious patients as comfortably as possible before sealing the cave entrance from outside. These mercy killings would haunt him for the rest of his life, yet at the moment they seemed like the only compassionate response to an impossible situation. March 26, 1945, at dawn, approximately 200 Japanese soldiers emerged from caves near Kitano Point and launched the final organized attack of the Battle of Iwo Jima. Unlike the screaming banzai charges that characterized earlier Pacific battles, this assault was conducted with military discipline and tactical sophistication. The Japanese moved in small groups using available cover, attempting to infiltrate American positions rather than simply charging into machine gun fire. They achieved tactical surprise, overrunning 2 Marine encampments and killing or wounding dozens of Americans before being surrounded and annihilated by overwhelming counterfire. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi participated in the attack, wielding his sword alongside common soldiers, and was killed during the fighting, though his body was never identified among the hundreds of Japanese corpses that littered the battlefield afterward. Baron Nishi died during the assault, shot multiple times while leading his men against a Marine machine gun position. Captain Ono survived the initial attack, but was cornered in a ravine with 3 other soldiers and chose to detonate a grenade against his chest rather than surrender. By mid-morning, the counterattack had ended with the complete destruction of the attacking force. March 26, 1945. The American commanders declared Iwo Jima secure after eliminating the last organized Japanese resistance. Yet this official pronouncement ignored the reality that hundreds of Japanese soldiers remained alive in sealed caves throughout the island. These survivors faced a choice between slow death from starvation and thirst in their underground prisons, or emergence to face certain death or capture by American forces. For many, this was not a simple decision. Surrender violated everything their culture and military training had taught them about honor and duty, yet starving slowly in darkness seemed equally intolerable. Private Satoru Omagari, a 20-year-old machine gunner who had survived the entire battle without serious injury, found himself trapped in a cave with 16 other soldiers after American engineers bulldozed the entrance shut. Their commander, a sergeant with a chest wound that bubbled blood with each breath, gathered the survivors and asked each man to state his preference, attempt to dig out and surrender, or commit group suicide with their remaining grenades. The debate that followed revealed the psychological complexity of Japanese soldiers at war's end, far from the monolithic death cult automatons portrayed in American propaganda. 5 men, including Omagari, argued for attempting to dig out and considering surrender if they could not rejoin Japanese forces elsewhere on the island. 7 men, including the wounded sergeant, insisted that death was preferable to the shame of capture. 4 men remained silent, paralyzed by the impossibility of choosing between 2 terrible options. Eventually, they reached a compromise that satisfied honor, while preserving life for those who chose it. The group would attempt to dig through the bulldozed entrance, and those who wished to surrender could do so, while those preferring death could commit suicide after the others had departed. This Solomon-like solution reflected a rationality that persisted even in extremis, though it contradicted the simplified narrative that Japanese soldiers invariably chose death over surrender. Corporal Kiyoshi Matsudo, a communications specialist who had operated radio equipment in Kuribayashi's command post, survived the final battle by being trapped in a deep tunnel when explosions collapsed the entrance to the headquarters cave. He found himself alone in absolute darkness, with no food, no water, and no realistic hope of rescue. For 3 days, he explored the tunnel system by touch, discovering 7 corpses of soldiers killed by explosion concussions and gas inhalation, but finding no alternate exits. On the 4th day, delirious from dehydration, he made the extraordinary decision to dig toward sounds of activity he could hear through the rock above, sounds that might be American salvage operations or simply hallucinations. Using a broken shovel blade, he excavated for 2 days through volcanic rock, eventually breaking through into daylight and immediately being captured by startled American engineers. His survival was accidental rather than intentional, the result of delirium and random luck rather than a conscious decision to surrender. Yet he lived while more deliberately courageous men died in their sealed caves. Dr. Tsuyoshi, who had survived the final attack by staying behind to care for patients, emerged from his cave on April 3rd with 2 walking wounded men who could no longer endure the darkness and thirst. They approached American positions with hands raised, expecting to be shot, yet were instead taken prisoner and given water, food, and medical treatment. The shock of this humane treatment disoriented Tsuyoshi more than combat had. His military indoctrination had taught him that Americans would torture and kill prisoners, yet the Marine Edic who treated his dysentery and dehydration showed professional compassion that transcended national enmity. In the POW cage on Iwo Jima, Tsuyoshi encountered 50 other Japanese survivors who had surrendered or been captured, each with stories of impossible choices and unexpected survival. These men represented less than 1% of the original garrison. Approximately 20,000 Japanese soldiers had died during the battle, making Iwo Jima the costliest Pacific campaign in terms of Japanese casualties relative to force size. The psychological aftermath of survival presented challenges that none of these men had anticipated. In Japanese military culture, surrender represented not just personal dishonor, but also dishonor to family, immunity, and ancestors stretching back generations. The survivors faced the prospect of eventual repatriation to a Japan where they would be treated as traitors and cowards for failing to choose death. Private Omagari, sitting in the POW compound, reflected that surviving the battle might ultimately prove more difficult than dying in it would have been. Corporal Matsudo contemplated suicide multiple times during his captivity, stopped only by the Marine Guards who had been warned that Japanese prisoners often attempted to kill themselves. Dr. Sueyoshi struggled with guilt over the patients he had euthanized and the fact that he lived while more heroic men had died fighting. Yet gradually, as weeks passed and the intensity of immediate trauma faded, these survivors began constructing narratives that allowed them to live with their choices. They had not surrendered cowardly. They had been trapped without options, captured while unconscious or forced into surrender by circumstances beyond their control. Thereby, irrationalizations, whether fully honest or not, provided psychological frameworks that made continued existence possible. April 18, 1945, American authorities transferred the Japanese POWs from Iwo Jima to Hawaii for further processing and interrogation, marking the beginning of a long journey home that would take more than a year. During the voyage aboard a transport ship, the prisoners received their first systematic information about how the war was progressing, and the news was uniformly catastrophic for Japan. American submarines had virtually eliminated Japanese merchant shipping, strangling the home island supply lines. American B-29 bombers were conducting massive incendiary raids on Japanese cities, burning entire urban areas to ash. The Philippines had been recaptured, Okinawa was under assault, and the American military was preparing for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that would dwarf even the Iwo Jima operation. Dr. Sueyoshi, listening to these reports from an English-speaking interrogator, realized that Kuribayashi's desperate defensive battle had accomplished its strategic objective. The casualty rates on Iwo Jima had contributed to American military and political calculations about the cost of invading Japan, ultimately influencing the decision to use atomic weapons instead. The Battle of Iwo Jima, viewed from the Japanese perspective, represented a kind of tactical success within strategic catastrophe. Kuribayashi's defensive campaign had inflicted approximately 26,000 American casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead, to defend an island that measured only 8 square miles. This staggering casualty rate, combined with similar losses during the Okinawa campaign, convinced American planners that a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and potentially millions of Japanese lives. According to historian John Dow's research on the Pacific War's ending, the casualty projections generated from Iwo Jima and Okinawa directly influenced President Truman's decision to authorize atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. From this perspective, the 20,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Iwo Jima had achieved Kuribayashi's goal of making American victory so costly that alternatives to invasion became preferable, though this alternative proved to be nuclear annihilation rather than negotiated peace. Private Omagari, reflecting on the battle years later, struggled with the meaning of what he had experienced. He had survived when better men died, yet survival had brought no reward beyond the opportunity to witness Japan's complete defeat and rebuild from ruins. The honor culture that had demanded he die on Iwo Jima had been discredited by the war's outcome. Japan had not been saved by such sacrifices, but had instead been utterly defeated and transformed by American occupation. Yet Omagari could not entirely repudiate his fallen comrades or the values they had died defending. They had fought with extraordinary courage under impossible conditions, had inflicted casualties far beyond what their numbers and resources should have permitted, and had maintained unit cohesion and tactical discipline until the end. These were military virtues worth recognizing, even if the cause they served had been flawed. He eventually found peace by constructing a dual consciousness, honoring the soldiers' courage while rejecting the imperial system that had wasted their lives in unwinnable battles. Corporal Matsudo, who had survived almost by accident, took a different lesson from his Iwo Jima experience. He became convinced that the entire Pacific War had been a monstrous mistake, driven by militarists who had hijacked Japanese policy and led the nation to catastrophe. The courage of men like Kuribayashi and Nishi seemed admirable, but ultimately futile. They had fought brilliantly in service of a cause that was already lost before the battle began. Matsudo embraced post-war Japan's pacifist constitution and democratic reforms. Argi, wing that the Battle of Iwo Jima demonstrated the bankruptcy of military values and the necessity of finding alternative methods for resolving international conflicts. His perspective remained controversial among veterans, many of whom felt that such views dishonored the dead. Yet Matsudo persisted in believing that honest assessment of the war's meaning required acknowledging its fundamental wrongness rather than glorifying the valor of those trapped in its machinery. Dr. Tsuyoshi, who lived until 1998, spent decades working with veterans organizations and peace groups, trying to memorialize the Battle of Iwo Jima in ways that honored sacrifice while warning against future wars. He gave lectures describing the medical horrors he had witnessed, the impossible ethical dilemmas he had faced, and the human cost of the battle that extended far beyond simple casualty statistics. Each Japanese soldier who died on Iwo Jima left behind parents, siblings, wives, children, and communities that suffered irreplaceable losses. Tsuyoshi estimated that the battle had created more than 50,000 grieving family members in Japan, people who received only terse notifications that their loved ones had died honorably for the emperor, without details of the terrible suffering that preceded those deaths. The American capture of Iwo Jima concluded on March 26, 1945, but the island's strategic value, the very on 20,000 Japanese soldiers had been sacrificed defending it, proved tragically limited. American planners had argued that Iwo Jima's airfields would provide emergency landing facilities for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan, and would serve as a base for fighter escorts to protect those bombers. In reality, by the time the island was fully operational, the war had less than 5 months remaining, and alternative tactical developments had reduced Iwo Jima's importance. The 2,465 emergency landings by B-29s that occurred on Iwo Jima undoubtedly saved aircrews' lives, yet military historians continue debating whether these lives saved justified the 26,000 American casualties and 20,000 Japanese deaths required to capture the island. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's final resting place remains unknown. His body was never conclusively identified among the thousands of Japanese corpses that littered the northern sector after the final battle. Some historians believe he committed ritual suicide after being wounded. Others suggest he died fighting with a sword against American Marines, and still others speculate he might have survived the final attack only to die in a sealed cave afterward. This uncertainty has contributed to his legendary status in Japan, where he is remembered as one of the Pacific War's most capable commanders, an officer who understood modern warfare, adapted tactics to technological realities, and extracted maximum effectiveness from limited resources. His letters to his family, discovered and published after the war, revealed a thoughtful, cultured man who loved art and poetry, yet fulfilled his military duty with uncompromising dedication. These personal writings humanized him for post-war audiences while complicating simplistic narratives about Japanese militarism. Baron Nishi's death during the final attack became a subject of particular interest to Americans because of his Olympic fame and his connections to American society from his time studying cavalry tactics in the United States during the 1920s. Several American officers who had known him before the war expressed sadness at learning he had died on Iwo Jima, seeing his death as emblematic of how war had destroyed relationships and connections that transcended national boundaries. Nishi's Olympic gold medal and his personal effects were eventually returned to his family by American veterans who had kept them as souvenirs, gestures of reconciliation that suggested some soldiers on both sides recognized the tragedy of having been forced to kill men they might otherwise have called friends. His story became the subject of books and films in both countries, transformed into a parable about honor, duty, and the universal humanity that persists even amid war's dehumanizing violence. The Japanese survivors who eventually returned home in 1946 and 1947 faced societies that had been utterly transformed by defeat and occupation. The emperor worship that had justified their sacrifice had been officially repudiated. The military hierarchy that had commanded their obedience had been dismantled, and American occupation authorities were actively promoting democratic values that contradicted everything their military training had taught. Some returning veterans, like Private Omagari, successfully adapted to this new Japan, finding civilian careers and building families while rarely speaking about their Iwo Jima experiences. Others, unable to reconcile their wartime values with post-war reality, struggled with alcoholism, depression, and social isolation. The psychological trauma of having survived when comrades died, what modern psychology calls survivor's guilt, was poorly understood in post-war Japan, leaving many veterans without adequate support or treatment. The Japanese perspective on the Battle of Iwo Jima evolved significantly over the decades following the war. Immediately after 1945, the battle was largely ignored in Japan. Discussing military campaigns meant confronting the catastrophic defeat and the suffering it had caused, topics that war-weary Japanese civilians preferred to avoid. During the 1950s and 60s, as Japan recovered economically and regained sovereignty, veterans began publishing memoirs, and historians started examining the Pacific War more systematically. Kuribayashi emerged as a hero, whose tactical brilliance and personal integrity could be celebrated without glorifying the militarism that had caused the war. By the 1980s and 90s, the Battle of Iwo Jima had been incorporated into a broader narrative about Japanese wartime experience that acknowledged both the courage of individual soldiers and the fundamental wrongness of the imperial aggression that had necessitated such sacrifices. The physical remnants of the Japanese defense on Iwo Jima, the elaborate tunnel systems, the concrete bunkers, the artillery emplacements, remained largely intact for decades after the battle because the island was retained by American forces and closed to civilian access. When Japanese officials were finally allowed to visit in the 1960s to recover remains of the dead, they discovered that the underground fortifications had been remarkably well preserved by the volcanic rock that entombed them. Over subsequent decades, American and Japanese personnel worked cooperatively to locate and excavate caves containing skeletal remains of soldiers who had died in sealed positions. These recovery efforts took on profound symbolic importance for both nations. For Japan, they represented delayed fulfillment of the promise that no soldier would be forgotten, while for America, they demonstrated respect for fallen enemies and reconciliation with a former adversary that had become an important ally. Dr. Tsueyoshi participated in several of these remains recovery missions during the 1970s and 80s, returning to Iwo Jima for the first time since his capture in 1945. Walking through the island's broken terrain, now overgrown with vegetation that had slowly reclaimed the blasted volcanic rock, he experienced conflicting emotions: grief for the suffering and death he had witnessed, relief at his own unlikely survival, and a strange detachment from the traumatic memories that had once dominated his consciousness. The cave where he had performed surgeries without anesthesia, where he had euthanized patients who could not be saved, had been sealed and was never reopened. The tunnels where thousands of soldiers had lived their final days, where men had died from wounds, dehydration, starvation, and suffocation, remained largely as they had been in 1945. Time capsules preserving artifacts of suffering that most people preferred not to confront directly. The annual memorial services held on Iwo Jima, attended by both Japanese and American veterans and their families, became occasions for reflection on war's meaning and cost. Former enemies who had tried to kill each other in 1945 met as old men in the 1980s and 90s, discovering their shared humanity and the arbitrary nature of the nationalistic hatreds that had made them enemies. Private Omagari, attending one such ceremony in 1994, found himself standing beside an American veteran who had fought in the same sector where Omagari had operated his machine gun. They could not determine whether they had actually exchanged fire. The battle's chaos made such precise reconstruction impossible. But they acknowledged the statistical likelihood that each had tried to kill the other. Their conversation, conducted through translators, revealed similar experiences of fear, exhaustion, and trauma, suggesting that the experience of combat created bonds that transcended the purposes for which that combat had been fought. The legacy of the Battle of Iwo Jima, from the Japanese perspective, remains deeply ambiguous. The battle demonstrated that Japanese soldiers could fight with extraordinary effectiveness, even against overwhelming material superiority, extracting casualty ratios that shocked American commanders and planners. Yet this tactical success occurred within a strategic framework of total defeat. Japan lost the battle, lost the war, lost its empire, and suffered occupation and fundamental transformation of its political system. The courage and sacrifice of the 20,000 soldiers who died defending Iwo Jima accomplished nothing except making American victory more costly, a result that may have influenced American decisions about how to end the war, but did not alter the fundamental outcome. For Japanese veterans, families of the dead, and historians examining the battle, the question remained whether such sacrifice had any meaning beyond the immediate human experiences of courage, loyalty, and endurance that it embodied. In contemporary Japan, the Battle of Iwo Jima occupies a complex position in collective memory. It is remembered as an example of military professionalism and individual courage, while simultaneously serving as evidence of the imperial system's willingness to waste lives in hopeless causes. School textbooks describe the battle factually, noting Kuribayashi's tactical innovations and the extraordinary casualty rates, but generally avoid either glorifying the defense or condemning the soldiers who fought it. This balanced approach reflects post-war Japan's broader effort to acknowledge its military history while rejecting the ideologies that produced the Pacific War. The battle serves as a reminder of what Japanese soldiers endured, what Japanese families lost, and what Japanese militarism cost. Lessons that continue shaping Japan's pacifist orientation and its resistance to remilitarization despite changing geopolitical circumstances. The final word on Iwo Jima's meaning perhaps belongs to the soldiers who fought there and somehow survived. Corporal Matsudo, interviewed shortly before his death in 2006 at age 84, reflected that his generation had been caught between two Japans, the imperial Japan that had demanded they die for the emperor, and the democratic Japan that emerged from defeat and questioned whether such deaths had served any worthy purpose. He had spent 60 years trying to reconcile these contradictory frameworks without fully succeeding. The battle had been both meaningful and meaningless, both honorable and wasteful, both necessary and tragic. Living with such contradictions, he suggested, was perhaps the most honest response to experiences that exceeded simple interpretation. The 20,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Iwo Jima deserve to be remembered not as propaganda symbols of either heroism or militaristic folly, but as human beings who faced impossible circumstances with courage and paid the ultimate price for decisions made by leaders far from the volcanic beaches where they fought and died. Their perspective, finally given voice decades after their deaths, complicates simple narratives about the Pacific War and reminds later generations that history is experienced most intensely by those who rarely get to write it.